Well, kia ora and a very warm welcome. I can see that you're all filing in right now. My name's Ian Kaplan, and some of you may know me from the Government Regulatory Practice Initiative, GREG, but that's not where I am today. By the kind invitation of the Treasury, I'm privileged to be introducing this very special event, which is live and recorded in the public domain. But before I do anything else, I'll open with Treasury's karakia. I do so now. Ko te tai whakarunga, ko te tai whakararo, ko te tai tokaro, ko te tai tonga, ko te tai hauararu, ko te tai rāwhiti, tēnei, ko te tai ohanga, huie takie. Now, as you will have seen from your Zoom invitation, which you accepted, this event is very much live and recorded in the public domain, which means that it's not only wherever you are, you could be anywhere, whenever you are, you're very welcome here. And members of the audience, we've got a number of, if I can put it this way, treats in store in terms of the next hour. The choreography will, broadly speaking, work like this. In just a moment, we're going to be joined by the Chief Executive of the Treasury, Dr. Caroline McLeish. Caroline will be giving a presentation introducing us to her regulatory systems and stewardship assurance leadership role, talking about the importance of regulatory stewardship in the public sector. And I know straight away, if there are any regular GREG viewers of our webinars and other products, that will be something that hits home and will be of massive interest. But there's more, because we're also getting, and this is an early hours, if not early minutes, report of the resource, the launch of a resource which is out today, the resource starting out with regulatory stewardship. It's just been released on the Treasury's website. And then there's more than that. Caroline will then be joined on a panel by two of her colleagues who attend the Regulatory Stewardship Chief Executives Group. That's Keith Manchford, Director and Chief Executive of the Civil Aviation Authority. And in a late change to the scheduled plan, on behalf of Caroline Tremaine, the Chief Executive of the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment, we're very pleased to be joined by Melanie Black, who is the General Manager, Regulatory Stewardship of the Regulatory Stewardship branch within the Ministry, and also attends Chief Executives Group. And that's where you'll come in ultimately, members of the audience, because you'll get a chance to have an interactive Q&A session with our three panelists. But the first item is to launch the new regulatory stewardship resource and talk much more about regulatory stewardship. So members of the audience, warm welcome to Dr. Caroline McLeish. Caroline, very much kia ora, and over to you, and I'll dematerialise and see you later.
Thank you so much, Ian, and kia ora koutou katoa. Thanks to everyone online for joining us today. And I do want to give a very special thanks to Ian and to GREG for hosting us. I also want to give them a shout out. GREG makes a tremendous contribution to quality regulation in New Zealand by connecting and supporting regulatory professionals. Our Treasury team is really delighted to collaborate with GREG on regulatory stewardship, and especially today for this exciting milestone to launch the Treasury's inaugural resource on regulatory stewardship for public sector agencies. So what is regulatory stewardship? Why does it matter? Stewardship, I think about it as leaving things in better shape for future generations. And regulatory stewardship means taking care of our regulatory systems as we would any other important asset, with sustained attention and improvements over time. Regulation is a powerful tool. It doesn't always get the same attention as other policy tools like spending and taxation, but a vast body of evidence tells us that regulation matters. It is an important reason for differences in economic performance and broader well-being across countries. And when we get regulation right, we set incentives for growth, for better living standards, as well as protect people from harm. But get it wrong, and we stifle innovation, limit rights and interests, and enable exploitation or even worse. Now, next slide. New Zealand compares well on many international measures of regulation. We were ranked first in the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business Index. We're near the top of the World Bank's Regulatory Quality Index and above average on OECD measures of how well regulatory impact assessments and stakeholder engagement works, as you can see here. But you can also see that there's much to improve on. We are a long way from the OECD top score. We're well behind the pack on OECD measures of regulatory evaluation. And we're slipping in the World Bank rankings on regulatory quality if you look at that measure across years. Costs of regulation are high in some sectors. For example, Te Wahanga, New Zealand's Infrastructure Commission, estimates that resource management consents average around 5.5% of infrastructure project costs and around 16% of small project costs. And when you compare that to other countries, those costs are really at the high end. And, like virtually almost every other country, New Zealand has experienced some cases of spectacular regulatory failure. Some, such as mining disasters, leaky homes, mis-selling of financial products, or road accidents arising from unsafe vehicles, have come at great human cost. Today's policy challenges are complex. They require action from a range of different stakeholders. As we all know, technology is advancing more and more rapidly, shocks are more frequent, and many long-term trends from climate change, changing demographics, low productivity growth, they're inadequately addressed. And a set and forget approach to regulation is just woefully unfit for that type of environment. Periodic big bang reforms in regulation with blunt tools like sunset clauses or 1 in 2 out rules, they might in some cases have benefits, but they're not going to give us regulatory systems that are adaptable, that are agile, and that are high performing for the uncertain future that we face. And that is where regulatory stewardship comes in. Next slide. So regulatory stewardship is about governance, monitoring, and care of our regulatory systems. It's about ensuring that all the different parts of the system work well together to achieve its goals, while also keeping the system fit for purpose over the longer term. As I've highlighted here, stewardship requires us to think about the long term. Are regulations resilient to change? It requires us to think about collaborating across the system, bringing together policy and implementation or central and local government or agencies with overlapping responsibilities. It requires us to articulate the outcomes that we're seeking with regulation and monitor whether they're being delivered. Are we learning and adapting as we go? And it means examining not just the flow in and out of regulations, but also the stock and whether that stock is fit for purpose. And the primary responsibility for undertaking regulatory stewardship rests with us as public servants. So where are we at today with regulatory stewardship? Well, regulatory stewardship has been in place for quite a while now in New Zealand. The statutory underpinning for regulatory stewardship was established back in 2013 with amendments to the State Sector Act that made stewardship an obligation for public service chief executives. On an international scale, regulatory stewardship is actually still a relatively novel concept, which means that a lot of us are still learning about how to best go about it. And there's always the relentless challenge of finding the time and the pace for stewardship amid a myriad of other urgent priorities. We have seen some great progress by some agencies. MBIE, the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment, has taken a really deliberate and systematic approach of stewardship assessments for its regulatory systems. The Parliamentary Council Office has established legislative stewardship role, focusing on improving the quality of regulation. And we've also seen a number of other departments from Internal Affairs, the Ministry of Primary Industries, Ministry of Education, Ministry of Transport, and others have developed regulatory systems amendment bills with a view of maintaining and adapting their regulations over time. And later in our panel discussion today, you'll hear more from my colleagues about some of the work that they're doing with their agencies. We recently surveyed public service agencies about their regulatory stewardship practices. Next slide. Of the more than 50 agencies that we surveyed, at least 70% have now explicitly assigned resources to support their regulatory stewardship role. 75% also have or are developing descriptions of their regulatory systems. And this is a really promising start. At the same time, most agencies do not yet have clear internal guidance or formal collaborative arrangements with partner agencies in the same regulatory system. And only 7% have comprehensive plans for maintaining and developing their regulatory systems. Now, COVID-19 pandemic, I think, has steepened our learning curve, and it really strengthens the case for prioritising this work. There are early signs when we look back on the last few years that in areas where regulatory stewardship work had been undertaken prior to the pandemic, the systems were able to respond more effectively to the shock. Stewardship means that those systems were already well understood and they were poised to adapt to the changes that we faced. We also saw a number of regulatory innovations that probably would have been unlikely in the absence of the pressures created by the pandemic. One of the more notable innovations was amendments to the Medicines Act and regulations, which enabled a more diverse range of people to administer vaccinations. As well as increasing the number of vaccinators, that meant that vulnerable populations were able to be vaccinated by people they already knew and trusted. And vaccination was made available at more convenient times and in more convenient places for people, like in pharmacies and on marae. And New Zealand's 94% vaccination rate would have been a lot harder to achieve without those regulatory changes. Another really interesting case of regulatory innovation that we saw was in the transport sector. In this case, providing the Director of Land Transport with a new package of emergency powers. The pandemic had made clear that the Director's existing powers to waive regulatory requirements in time-critical emergencies were quite limited. So, for example, waivers for warrants of fitness, vehicle licensing services required a really complex and time-consuming process to change regulations. So a review prompted the Ministry of Transport to provide the Director of Land Transport with powers to make emergency interventions directly. And it was an initiative that helps to future-proof the regulatory system to be more responsive in the event of emergencies ahead. When we look across the public sector, we saw more than 110 regulatory changes that were agreed through fast-tracked pandemic-related regulatory approvals. A number of those changes have brought some more permanent improvements, like enabling electronic transactions for corporate governance functions and also in the courts. On the other hand, we saw other systems that showed resilience and adaptability without new regulatory change. For example, in the Public Finance Act, the use of existing emergency powers ensured that funding of government services was uninterrupted during the pandemic. And so with that stewardship lens, we do need to really ask what lessons can we take from the pandemic so that our regulation is more resilient to future shocks. So let me talk about some of the ways in which we're going about building regulatory stewardship and supporting regulatory stewardship across the sector. In 2020, the Public Service Commissioner gave me a new functional leadership role for regulatory stewardship. This builds on the Treasury's long-standing mandate for strategic coordination of the regulatory management systems, including the regulatory impact analysis system. My functional lead role is supported by a Chief Executives Group, which comprises the CEs of 9 public service departments and Crown entities, which you can see here. Our CE group guides and oversees the stewardship work of our regulatory strategy team here in the Treasury. And our team is also connected to agencies across the public sector through a working group. So as you can see here, it's a really collaborative effort to build regulatory stewardship capability right across government. Our survey results show that agencies are keen to learn more about regulatory stewardship. And so to help with this, we provided the new regulatory stewardship resource that we've released today. Come to the next slide. So the resource outlines 9 topics that agencies can work through to develop their regulatory stewardship practice, from system fundamentals, things like mapping the regulatory system, assessing it for gaps and for overlaps, to topics like the international context, things like understanding regulatory obligations internationally or opportunities to recognise international regulatory standards through mutual recognition arrangements. Each topic includes prompts for agencies to discuss and test their stewardship practice. We outline what early indicators of progress could look like, as well as markers of agencies that are taking their practice to that next level. I think the real value in the resource is going to be in the conversations that are sparked by bringing the right people together in a room and working through the resource. And having stepped through it with the Treasury's own regulatory systems in mind, I came away with a large set of improvements to consider further, even in some of those areas where we feel that our stewardship practice is more advanced. We recognise that all regulatory systems are different. Individual agencies are going to be best placed to consider what good looks like in their own unique context. But nonetheless, the resource highlights some common issues that apply across a wide range of areas. We've aimed the resource primarily at agencies who are early in their stewardship journey. So you don't need to have an in-depth understanding of regulatory stewardship to be able to use the resource. But at the same time, I think the questions and the prompts that we provide are ones that even the most sophisticated agencies who are really advanced in regulatory stewardship thinking, even those sophisticated agencies should be asking these sorts of questions frequently. For example, no one should ever be above reflecting on whether their leadership culture values stewardship, whether their leadership culture is open to negative findings, or whether it's escalating risks to the right levels within an organisation. So the resource is one of the many tools that you might use to guide your stewardship practice. We know it's only one of many tools. In each topic, we also provide links to other tools, to other resources that are available across the public sector and also internationally. Beyond the resource document, I also wanted to highlight today that the Treasury and GREG have recently established a regulatory stewardship community of practice. And on to the next slide. We encourage anyone who has an interest in regulatory stewardship to join this group, whether you're an experienced practitioner or whether you're just starting out and wanting to learn about stewardship from the start. We're really excited to be partnering with GREG on this community. I think it's just a great way to enable all of us, no matter what our position, no matter which area of regulation we're looking at, all of us to share knowledge, to share some experience, and to learn from each other. Members can choose to join the regular meetings, engage on the Teams channel, take discussions offline into smaller groups, or a little bit of all of that. And we're optimistic that this community will get us collaborating more, and also be a key part of growing regulatory stewardship in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Collaboration is critical to the development of the resource that we're releasing today. We see it very much as a living document, and much like regulatory stewardship as a concept, it needs to be tested, it needs to be adapted as our understanding of stewardship evolves and our practice develops. Our hope is that the community of practice will help us to learn and develop new resources over time that everybody can use. So in closing, a few thanks and a request and a whakatauki. I do want to take the opportunity to thank all of those who have put in what's been a tremendous amount of effort to get us to today's launch of our regulatory stewardship resource. And starting with my team here in the Treasury, well done, team. It's great to be at this point. And I'm also really grateful to our colleagues at GREG for facilitating the event today and for partnering in the community of practice. To the agencies who have contributed to the working group known as RSAS, they provided enormously valuable input to the work. And also a big thanks to my fellow chief executives in the Regulatory Stewardship CEs group, who have been a constant source of rich insights and advice to guide this work. So thanks to everybody who's been involved in this important mahi. I would like to finish with one request as well. Please do take a look at the resource, but most importantly, consider how you will leave your regulatory system in better shape for the future. Is the regulatory system that you work on going to be responsive to the next big new technology? Will it be resilient to the next crisis? Or is there a chance that it might be the next regulatory failure? So how are you stewarding your regulatory systems? And finally, putting those thanks and that request together, let me close with the GREG whakatauki. Me mahi tahi tātou mō te oranga o te katoa. Let us work together for the good of all, and in this case, for regulatory stewardship, which is really about lifting living standards for all New Zealanders. So thank you, and kia ora. And Ian, back to you to introduce the panel.
Thank you so much. That's absolutely terrific. Now, members of the audience, you'll get a chance to e-talk stewardship with Carolee and the panel in due course. But I just want to put in a commercial break and a commercial plug to really underscore what Carolee said about the GREG and Treasury Regulatory Stewardship Community of Practice. You've seen a contact detail on the slides, but you can also have a look on the GREG website at more details. Both GREG and the Treasury, as Carolee said, provide kaitiaki for this group in recognition of the Treasury's functional leadership in this space. If you're involved in local and or central government, it's probably a thing to look at. It's probably a thing for you. And either in the Q&A box or the chat function, you'll see very shortly the link which would take you there. Now, just in terms of further flight plan, I will hand over to Carolee in just a moment. And I see that my colleague Eva has kindly put that out already in the chat. Thank you, Eva. I will hand back to Caroline in just a moment to have a chat with the panel about the reflections that have come from this information. But just before that, we will go to a Q&A session at the end, and it's perfectly okay for you members of the audience to put in Q&A now or comments, and if you like them or have a particular sort of affinity with them, put the thumbs up against it. So when we get to it, as time permits, we'll sort of be able to work out who wants to ask what. So I will dematerialize, the rest of the panel will rematerialize with Caroline, and I'll see you all later, members of the audience.
Thanks so much, Ian. So we are really fortunate to have both MB and the Civil Aviation Authority represented on both the Regulatory Stewardship CEs group, as well as our agency working group, RSATs. Keith and Melanie have a huge amount of experience in all things regulation and are enormous contributors to our CEs group. It's helped create some very lively discussions and debates across our colleagues. So Mel and Keith, thanks so much for joining the panel. I wanted to start with just a very general question for both of you, just your perspectives on why regulatory stewardship is important. Perhaps start with you, Mel.
Thank you, Caroline, and thank you very much for having me along today. My apologies from our Chief Executive, Carolyn, who's unwell this week. Look, I think regulatory stewardship is really important to MB because so many of our people work in regulatory systems, and we have a huge responsibility to the people of New Zealand that we operate and participate and run those systems as well as we possibly can in order to get the best outcomes that we can. I think at a more organisational level, it's really important because it's one of the ways that we join up across all of our different functional areas. So, you know, MB is a large ministry. We have people doing policy work right through to service centres and frontline enforcement. And it can be really difficult to break away from those functional silos. And regulatory stewardship helps us to think in those horizontals, to think about how our work joins up across and the outcomes that we're trying to achieve from each of those functions.
That's great. Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Mel. Keith, up to you. Just a little bit about your perspective on why you think regulatory stewardship is important.
Thanks, Caroline. Yeah. So coming from at the moment an operational regulatory agency that's part of a broader system, it helps to frame the way we should be thinking about our task, not only the business of delivering regulation, but also how we can think about how we can contribute to its ongoing learning and adaptation. We suffer, like many agencies, from a legacy of set and forget in terms of our regulatory systems, particularly at the rules level, and the history of relationships with different parties in the system. So this is a bit of a shot in the arm, actually, to look at this guidance and think about how can we engage together to improve the thing over time and move on from the set and forget. And it's very real in a regulatory agency. You're dealing with regulated parties and the beneficiaries of regulation on a daily basis. And it's right in your face about the impact of regulation, the good and the bad of it. And all of our people have information, knowledge, and experience about what could be improved. If we've got a system where we can capture that and move it into the right place in the system, at the right level of governance and get change, I think we're all better off.
That's great, thanks. So maybe just building on that, Keith. So it is about a system, and there are many different components of that system, many different people who are involved, different stakeholders. Many of them have different interests as well. So how do you think we can best support collaboration with the different stakeholders within a regulatory system? What are the sorts of things that you do in practice to get that collaboration working?
Yeah, so probably a good example I could use at the moment, it's reasonably specific. We've got a bunch of people in the aviation sector that have delegated responsibilities, and there's certainly reference to delegation and devolution in the document. I've actually used the material from the document in engagement with those parties in a meeting recently, and it provided an excellent context and a way of saying, look, this is a regulatory system we're all part of. Let's think of it as an asset, and it's an asset that we want to care for and we want to consistently improve. And we could take the view that this is kind of theoretically interesting in the policy circles in Wellington, But when you discuss it like that on the ground level with people in the system themselves, they get it and they want to be part of improvement. So if we surround that with our engagements with the ministry that has policy responsibility, with other agencies that also impact on the aviation sector, and we take those discussions to all parts of the system and all parties, I think we've got a better chance of making improvement.
Thanks, I completely agree. And when I took a look at the stewardship resource from a Treasury perspective, one of the questions, one of the prompts that really gave me pause and sparked some reflection was about the sort of cross-agency governance arrangements. So what's the authorising environment for stewardship? And we very often have arrangements that rely on peer person relationships, I guess, individual relationships that have been built up. And actually that prompt was about, and we benefit from that, but it means that the system is a little bit vulnerable to people leaving, and you have new people, new relationships need to be formed. And so, how can we think of, without putting too much structure, without putting lots of bureaucracy in, how do we think about the sorts of governance arrangements that can facilitate that collaboration on an ongoing basis? So that's something that we're giving a lot more thought to as we build up our stewardship practice within the Treasury. But I might come back to Mel and kind of, I guess, building upon this theme around collaboration, but moving to this view of a system for regulation. You spoke about the benefits of stewardship in kind of joining up different parts of MB and breaking down silos. So can you talk a little bit about what that's meant in practice? What are some of the practical things that you've done in MB to achieve that system view?
Yeah, so one of the things that we're prioritising in MB is pushing forward with the concept of regulatory system governance. And, we call it governance, but it's really about collective leadership. It's about bringing the people who have responsibility in their day jobs for different parts of a regulatory system together around the table and making sure that they're actually working together to look after and operate and design and just make that system work as best it can. So we have regulatory governance formally in place for around 2/3 of our systems at present. And as an organisation, we've decided that that's a priority for the year ahead, that we'd like to get those sorts of arrangements in place across all of our regulatory systems.
That's great. That's great. And so how many different parts of the system are involved in that sort of grouping?
Well, it depends a little bit on the system. So I like to think that all of the functions that are associated with a regulatory system should be involved. Sometimes we need to start a bit smaller. We're government. We tend to be a little bit shy about how wide we can go, first of all. But if I look at something like the building system here in MB, we have 3 GMs who comprise the core building. We call it the Building Systems Steering Group. And they get together regularly. They're supported by their managers, and they have some really great conversations about system level risks that they can see and how they need to work together to address those.
Yeah, that's great. And I think to me, it just highlights a point that there's no one size fits all, that taking a system perspective can mean quite different things in different circumstances. I guess one of the areas where I'm involved in, where I see a pretty good arrangement for a systems view, is the Council of Financial Regulators, which of course MB is engaged in as well, where we have membership from the Reserve Bank, from Treasury, from MB, from ComCom and from the FMA. And it's an opportunity to really think systemically about financial markets and how different regulators interact, how that affects the regulated party, and then how that affects, the end beneficiary, I guess, of regulation. And, different layers, I guess, to the sort of systems view. One is just taking a look within government, but then there's also how do we think about the system in terms of how we interact with regulated parties and how we understand impacts on beneficiaries. So, different layers to that systems thinking. But MB, I mean, you also really highlight that MB has a very large number of diverse regulatory systems. It's quite extraordinary, the coverage of regulatory systems that MB has. So, how have you operationalised stewardship across such a broad?
Yeah, so I mean, there was some decisions made that predate me around making sure that we've identified basically 18 regulatory systems across MB, and we often get asked, how did you come up with that number and things like that? And there's an element of practicality there. So you sort of want to think about a system as something that makes sense, that does need to operate as a system, and where there's strong interrelationships. But also, you don't want too many of these things as an organisation, otherwise it becomes too hard to operationalise and roll out. And within MB, I'm really fortunate that we've had chief executives who have really championed regulatory stewardship over the last coming up 10 years, and have put resource into supporting, developing public sector thinking about what good regulatory stewardship practice looks like. And my branch is fortunate enough to have the space that we can both do that thinking, but also then work alongside system leaders in order to help them to do things like set up their governance or establish a risk-based approach for their systems. And, there's a bit of learning by doing that goes on there. We don't always get it right, but I think our practice is getting stronger.
Yeah. And I'd mentioned in my opening remarks the MB stewardship maturity assessments. Mm-hmm. So what's the status of implementing those across the different regulatory systems in MB?
They're pretty well advanced. Yep. So I think we must be approaching about half of our systems have been through a stewardship maturity assessment since the branch was established. So, in the last couple of years. And I see that Greg's just pointed out in the chat that ComCom are currently participating in one of our stewardship maturity assessments. So, that's part of taking a system view. Because we want to look at the whole system, we're increasingly trying to do those assessments alongside other agencies. Housing was great. They were the first agency to step up and do a joint assessment with us, looking at the tenancy system. And we're really enjoying working with ComCom at present.
Yep, that's great. And I might come back and just ask if there are any particular insights or changes that those maturity assessments have led to. But just thinking about exploring the idea of systems a little further, Keith, I just wanted to ask your views about how you deal with different objectives within a system. So. We've talked about building relationships and collaborating right across the system, but at times there are different interests at play. And naturally, different agencies, different parts of the system will have somewhat different objectives. And so how do you think about relationship building and resolving some of those differences?
Yeah, I think the framework that I'd use is a fairly basic one around trying to get down to the common interests. And in a safety regulation context, it's quite easy to work out what the objective and what the focus is that we have in common, and then talk about the different roles we play and to get to that outcome. And it's quite, I think the system issue, the definition of the system issue is a very interesting one. So you take transport, or is it aviation? If it's transport, it's aviation, maritime, road, rail. Even in safety, and the safety elements of aviation or maritime crossover with EPA, for example, or WorkSafe. So who's in the system and who isn't? And I agree with Mel. You've got to just draw a ring around it that makes sense for the purpose of analysing it, and then get people together. And I think it's the first thing to do. I think is to work out what the common interests are, and what the different roles are in achieving those interests. And it's kind of like a number of people looking through a range of different windows into a common thing, and working out that you've got a part to play and respecting each other's roles.
Yeah, absolutely. Can you maybe give us an example too? I think the question about how you draw the ring around different systems. Have you been in environments where you've started with one ring and then gradually realised that you need to expand a little bit beyond? I think one of the examples in Treasury is thinking about system domestically, but actually there's quite a strong interaction with international systems sometimes, and we need to think about harmonisation. Any thoughts on how you go about drawing that boundary and when you need to be flexible?
Yeah, I go back to when I was at Maritime. I'm not speaking for Maritime New Zealand, of course, but that being new to the transport sector, I thought, part of the transport sector, part of the transport system, and then quickly realised that the sort of natural partners in terms of the work that went on were more EPA and WorkSafe. So the people that you want to engage with, and it wasn't a structured stewardship kind of activity. It led to a relatively informal grouping of chief executives from those agencies that would, and also chairs at the beginning, that have expanded into a regulatory sort of Crown entity chair group. So I think it's a matter of, I saw it through the lens of what is the impact we're trying to have through our regulatory activities and where do they cross over, and what is the best cluster, not what is the sort of formal assignment of the agency in terms of a machinery government exercise. Because that's not always the answer in terms of what's common.
That's great. Mel, perhaps back to you, just on some of the lessons from taking a stewardship approach. What changes has it led to? Does it mean you do anything differently after you do a stewardship maturity assessment? What are you seeing?
So we see quite a bit coming out of the stewardship maturity assessments, right? And I often feel bad for my colleagues. We try not to walk away, and we have a team who are there to help them to implement change, because that's what it's really about, right? So we do the assessments, but for us, the overall goal is to improve our systems. And sometimes the assessments are the right way into identifying what needs to change and improve. But sometimes, a conversation at a lighter level, like the sort of one gets prompted, I think, by the stewardship resource we're releasing today, that can equally be a good way into saying, like, what do we need to do differently? So if I think about some of the, the practical changes that we've seen coming through, following a assessment of our intellectual property system, I think it was last year, one of the things that was identified was that they needed to go away and do a little bit more work around roles and responsibilities and the charter. And the team have been working away on that and came back and presented it to one of our governance groups recently, and it was really great to see them. But what was even better was to hear that they'd discovered going through that process that even though they've been using similar language between our policy and our operational areas, they weren't necessarily using it with the same meaning. So there's a lot of value in those conversations, and in terms of actually standing back from the day-to-day and going, hey, when we say this is what I mean, and I'm assuming that you're covering this thing off in your role, and not taking it for granted that our colleagues have the same understanding.
It's a great example. Some similar conversations within the Treasury as well. Keith, from your perspective, changes that have been generated by taking a stewardship approach, and I know you said that you've gone through the resource, the stewardship resource. What sort of questions has it raised for you, and are you doing things differently?
Well, I think it's actually triggered me to think about the need to get involved in more structured stewardship discussions in the system that we're part of. I think I'd say that we do a lot of stewardship activities without probably having understood that that's what they were in the framework that we operate in. Certainly in our policy team, I think they understand fully that what they're doing is a stewardship activity. We have good systems for capturing information, triaging it, getting it onto the table for discussion with the policy agency. But I don't think we are truly executing regulatory stewardship in the sort of system sense that is encouraged through this guidance. So for me, this is a great document that I can use in talking to senior colleagues in all of the agencies we have great bilaterals and some multilateral engagements with, to put a much bigger picture around the stewardship discussions. And I think it will advance our day-to-day work that is actually stewardship into a much more systematized kind of thing.
Yeah. Yes, it was interesting in the survey that we conducted of agencies on stewardship practices, just the amount of stewardship work that was taking place, but agencies didn't necessarily label it or think of it in that way. And so I think one of the benefits of these conversations is as you highlight, Mel, also just getting a common language around some of this thinking. But then there's also kind of extending the work a little bit more, just prompting some questions and some thoughts about how we go beyond just reactive regulatory work to thinking in a more proactive way about how we leave the systems better for others in the future. One of the questions that we often get asked in the Treasury when we talk about stewardship is just creating the time and the space, resourcing. Things are pretty busy. There's always some urgent priority to take care of in our day-to-day work. And so, how does one really carve out the time to do stewardship well? And given that you both are pretty advanced on the journey, can you talk a little bit about how you have been able to create the space for stewardship? Maybe Keith first.
Okay. Well, it's a matter of, I think, building it into your kind of work practice. Actually, it's not something. It's not additional. And again, I don't think we're advanced in a regulatory stewardship context thinking about it in the way that it's described in the resource. I think we're advanced doing a whole lot of things that are regulatory stewardship. And yeah, so for us, it's a matter of having a pretty good internal system for gathering and collating, collecting, analysing information. Whether it leads to change that we would like is always a question of resources and priorities and things, but at least knowing what needs to be done is a good start in stewardship. And the second thing is that we have a pretty well established and quite mature relationship with industry representative groups that takes part in our assessment of things that might need to be improved. So that's, I think, real action at a stewardship level. But having said that, it's not all of the parties in the system. So it doesn't typically include other agencies that might be engaged or whatever. So I think that's the next step for us.
Yeah, I think that point, making sure that it's built into your planning, that it's just that stewardship is part of your core business. It's not something that you do when you get to it, when you deal with the urgent priority, but it is actually the foundation of our work. Any thoughts from the MBA experience, Mel?
Oh, I think the challenge is much greater for my colleagues who are the leaders of the regulatory systems that MBA are responsible for. But I'd like to think that where they've established strong practices, they would tell you that it makes it easier in the long run, that they've got better ways of joining up and maintaining those relationships through people changing and those shared understandings. And that actually it's a change in the way that you work, which takes a little bit of getting used to, but it's a better way to work in the long run.
Yes. And I think that is really what we saw in the pandemic, that those systems that had been stewarded were much easier to adapt than those which, I'm certainly aware of cases where we just had to go back and say, okay, how does this actually work? And what can we draw upon to adapt to this crisis that we're in? So that's a terrific point, that actually there is a big investment, but the return on that investment is enormous, and over the long run, it makes your life easier to do the stewardship work along the way, rather than wait until crisis and wait until it's forced upon you. Yeah, I might. I'm not sure if we have many questions. I don't see much in the chat bar, but Ian, I might hand to yourself just to see whether anything else is coming through.
Thanks very much, Carol. We do have a few coming through, actually, and thank you to Mel and to Keith. Just members of the audience, Eva has been super efficient and has put the links out earlier up in the chat function to the resource and other associated materials online. Just one of the questions that members of the audience keep them coming out. I'll just pick the first of the three, not in chronological order, simply because one time at 234 asked how much of your thinking is being informed by the beneficiaries of outcomes of the system rather than internal to the government. And I think, Keith, you touched on this at, I'm sorry to be so sad, 237, when you were talking about the emphasis on outcomes rather than the machinery of government. But Carol, I might just switch this one to you just in terms of pleasury thinking on this work and generally. What's the sort of relative impacts and thinking being informed by beneficiaries of outcomes of the system rather than the internal, I guess, machinery of government point we mentioned?
Yeah, well, when I think about stewardship, I think one of the core elements of it is really a focus on the outcomes. Why do we have regulation? What is the purpose? What are we seeking to achieve? Who is going to benefit from this regulation? So, thinking about beneficiaries needs to be right at the centre and thinking about stewardship. It's the purpose. Why are we doing this? And we need to build that into all aspects of stewardship work. And I think most importantly, how we measure outcomes and how we monitor those and then adapt the system over time to see if we are achieving those outcomes. So, I think in assessing performance of systems and risks in systems, we always need to come back to the beneficiaries and ask that question, is our regulatory system achieving the outcomes that are intended? I think in terms of more direct collaboration and engagement, with beneficiaries, that will depend very much on the nature of regulation. Beneficiaries in some systems, and maybe Keith, you might tell me otherwise, but something like aircraft safety, it's about just knowing that the experts have made flying safe. You don't necessarily need to be consulted on every individual regulation as a beneficiary, but in other cases, it will be really important for beneficiaries to actually be quite closely involved, even in co-designing in some cases. So, it will really depend on the nature of the system and the circumstances as to how closely beneficiaries should be involved in stewardship activities on a day-to-day basis.
Yes.
But at the core, stewardship activity is about achieving the outcomes for beneficiaries, and we need to have that in mind all the time.
Yes. Mel, I can see you nodding very much at that point.
Yes. And I was thinking, I kind of missed a trick earlier when Carolee asked me about how we're operationalising regulatory stewardship at MB, because we have been going through quite a big strategy process this year, and we've established what we refer to as 7 leadership expectations for regulatory stewardship. And one of those is very much around understanding how our systems are impacting, how they're delivering for beneficiaries, and how they're impacting on regulated parties, so that we understand things like the cost of compliance. So I think great question and even better answer, Carolee. Thank you.
Yeah,
and members of the audience, keep pumping those questions through. Keith, sorry, I almost took off without you.
Oh, that's right. Sorry, took off. Well done. Picking up on Carolee's comment, yes, we don't have a lot of engagement with the beneficiaries of aviation safety regulation. We do an annual Be Safe, Feel Safe survey, which picks up on people's, are they safe and do they feel safe? So that's the way we input the sort of beneficiaries picture into that. I could say on the security side of it, the beneficiaries of aviation security are often us as we go through security screening. I'm not sure we all see that as a pleasurable experience, but it's very necessary, and that's, it is an important part of the regulatory system for maintaining safety and security in aviation. So I think it is interesting thinking about the beneficiaries, and as Carolee said, it's not always a direct contact.
Context is often all, and I guess also just moving it to a slightly different dimension. I'm going to elide these last 2 questions because I think they sort of come to the same thing. The first one is, how do we make regulatory systems stewardship a genuine part of the political agenda? And the question it posits, might it be possible to create the social infrastructure commission to mirror the current physical infrastructure one, I guess because of the asset point that we discussed earlier. On the political point, next question immediately says, any advice on how to convince ministers about the importance of regulatory stewardship? So the political sale, I guess, of this. Carolee, to you first.
So I think, yeah, the case for change, stewardship itself will help us to be able to communicate the benefits of regulation. So, a stewardship approach means monitoring performance. We get a better picture of what is and what isn't working. It's better line of sight to the risks that regulations might fail, and the opportunities for getting growth, investment, job creation, or any other great outcome. It can highlight those opportunities, and so by practicing stewardship, we're able to better communicate to ministers the benefits of a system and the need for potentially more investment or for decisions on further improvement. So I see regulatory stewardship as that really critical first step of public service agencies in being able to create a narrative that is appealing for ministers.
Yes, indeed. It's almost, I think, Mel, it's almost an advert in itself potentially to the minister, I think, isn't it? Or could be.
That's right. That's right, indeed.
Heath, what about you from your perspective? I mean, you're talking about particular sorts of frames of reference within the CAA and that particular regulatory system. Again, how do you advertise the merits of stewardship to those in the political arena?
Well, yeah, I think it's a difficult one. I think we're still operating on the basis of dealing with the things that are front and centre in terms of engagement with ministers around the regulatory systems we have, and we're probably in a situation where transport rules, aviation rules, would really benefit from a good dose of stewardship, forward-looking kind of learning and adapting. The volume of the regulation is very difficult. So we're having discussions with both the ministry and the minister about that. It's a very crowded policy agenda, as we all know. So we tend to get space for the most urgent things. And we're also being overtaken, I think, by emerging technology and the need for new rules and regulatory frameworks to address that is starting to crowd out some of the historic stuff that should probably be dealt with. So I think that the whole business of ministers, government understanding the importance of fit for purpose, effective regulation, both historic and new, will be a product of continued regulatory stewardship focus across the public sector.
Absolutely. And Mel, I mean, you're in a house where there are double-digit numbers of systems to which stewardship attaches. Any sort of thing to add on that?
Yeah, I agree that it can be a challenge in a busy policy agenda, but a lot of regulatory stewardship happens away from the policy space. And I'd also come back to Carol's point around we're still learning. A lot of this is about understanding in building that picture of how systems are performing and what needs to be done to improve them. And if we don't have that information, then we're not in a strong position to go to ministers and engage with them.
Yeah, no, understood. Now, just arcing back, and keep them coming, members of the audience. This is good. The questions coming through. First question, which was up on the docket, Carol, I think this one's for you. Does a functional leadership role mean that the Treasury will monitor and report on stewardship activity and outcomes across all other departments and agencies? I think so. What does it mean in practice at this stage?
Yeah, our number one focus is on supporting agencies to build their own regulatory stewardship practice. This is not something that we are doing to agencies. It's very much trying to facilitate the exchange of good practices, to distill those good practices into, we have this guidance, this resource to support agencies themselves to ask the questions on what's working, what isn't, and how can they improve. We're just like stewardship itself, learning, and we'll be adapting over time. I have a lot of great guidance from my CE colleagues and great work that's done by the working group to identify how we can be most useful for the sector. But no, it's really about supporting agencies to build their stewardship practice.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess sort of concomitant with that, and I see one of the questions here, the international dimension, and I think anyone can sort of pick this up if they'd like. Regulations increasingly in international and transactional, forgive me, transnational activity, probably is transactional sometimes, but how is reg stewardship landing with other countries you're dealing with, perhaps the Westminster types, Australia, the UK, Canada? But how does the concept in the panel's experience sort of land with counterparts overseas? Any thoughts on that?
Shall I have a go at that one to start with?
Please do, Mel.
I think Carolee described regulatory stewardship as something slightly novel, and I think that they're really interested. I had a lovely engagement with the Australian, I think it was Department of Finance earlier in the year, where they're very interested in what we're doing here in New Zealand. And my colleague Mark Steele, who will be known to many of you, is currently over at OECD in Paris. And I know he'll be sharing an update on our work over there because they're interested. I think internationally, we're still trying to find ways of better stewarding and managing regulation, other than some of the approaches that Carolee referred to in her presentation, like one in and one out, that when you go back and you think about outcomes and beneficiaries, and regulation was there for a purpose. Yes, it needs to be improved and updated, and sometimes it does need to be removed, but we need to be a little bit more nuanced and less blunt than some of those traditional approaches.
Also, you can read the guide, which is online, and we've seen the links. And I was rereading it last night, and it's a well-written piece in terms of setting out what stewardship is and how it bites in practice on a multi-layered basis. Let's just take a look at some more questions. We're almost coming to the top of the hour, and one of the questions here is a very practical one and a very relevant one. Does the panel have any tips, I think it could be a cry for help, on ensuring the proactive care of systems while also keeping on top of reactive current risks and issues? Because, I mean, it is, there's the day's work to be done. What do we all say to that?
Can I jump in there, Ian? Sorry, Carolee.
Please.
Just before I get onto that, I just want to pick up on something Melanie said before. I fell into the trap of talking about stewardship as being a policy issue and about policy and regulatory frameworks. It's actually about everything to do with the way the system works, the capability, the approach you take to your task. And what I'd say to the question you just posed is, the first question we would always ask if something's not working is, should we be doing something different? Have we got a choice around thinking differently about what the law says, or using a tool like an exemption? Is there a way we can get through to the outcome we want through the practice rather than the policy? But again, to that question, I think it's a matter of building in the concept of working in the system and working on the system is your work, not one or the other. They're both really important.
That's a really good question. Mel.
I was going to say, Keith, sometimes it's also about having a chat to your colleagues. At the GREG conference the other week, an issue came up, and the regulator said, we don't really feel we've got the tools to deal with this. And the person at the table I was sitting with, a very senior person who was responsible for another regulatory area, said, I think I might. We've actually got a lot of levers across government. When we stay focused on the outcomes that we're after, sometimes it's a matter of just having the right conversations.
Thank you, Mel. Final word on all of this, Carolee, to you.
Oh, well, it's been a terrific conversation. I want to thank everybody for asking some great questions, and to Mel and Keith and yourself, Ian, for a really interesting conversation. I just go back to my earlier remarks just on the importance of regulatory stewardship. We know it matters. It makes a big difference for living standards for New Zealanders. And it's incumbent on all of us to make sure that we are thinking long term. We're thinking about the outcomes. We're thinking across the system, and not just the incremental, but just on the stock of all of our regulations. And I hope that this resource is a useful tool for people to have the conversations they need to have to take that stewardship mindset.
Place to end it, Carolee, Mel, Keith, and members of the audience, yourselves, thank you very much indeed. I close now with Treasury's closing karakia. I do so now. Piki te kaha, piki te ora, piki te waira, huie taikie. Members of the audience, stay safe, stay well, and from all of us here in the virtual studio, ka kite ala.